The association that represents directors of children's services departments at local councils has called on the government to take action against those young people and children that they say have been influenced by the far right. They are saying that after the Southport protests, there needs to be action in schools to expel young people who are being poisoned against British multicultural society by people like Tommy Robinson. Now, I have to say, we have seen a crackdown on people who are patriotic. We have seen attempts to bang on people's doors if they are exercising their right to free speech. We have seen hugely draconian and over-the-top prosecutions and indeed sentences for people who are doing nothing other than attempting to stand up for their community. But now to see that extended to children and young people is extremely worrying. This story you won't see anywhere else because it's behind the paywall at the local government chronicle. Hello everyone, this is Andre Walker. Thanks so much for watching this video. This video once again was supported by the Patriot Fund. You can get details of how to donate to the fund below. Okay, we've been out scouring for some of the stories that other media outlets may have missed. There's lots of people on the internet, lots of people on YouTube commenting on what's going on, and they do phenomenally well. But I think we need to take a bit of a deeper dive. Okay. So let's look at what has taken place here. The letter that was written to the local government chronicle was written by the Association of Children's Services Directors. And effectively what it does is it lays out concerns about the number of criminal prosecutions against children who have protested against uncontrolled immigration. Now, one would have thought that the letter ought to have been, well, why are we criminalising children and young people who are just trying to stand up for their community? And we get the same old chestnut that they're being lied to and we have to do something about the misinformation. The letter effectively says there's a couple of things that need to happen. Number one, schools need to be much better at explaining why proof that multiculturalism and immigration has failed. They have to be better at debunking that claim, even though it's true. Figures like Tommy Robinson need to be rigorously opposed in public, and obviously we need to use taxpayers' money to go into schools to start debunking what this man says. And moreover, what we shouldn't do, what was not mentioned in the letter, is that they're going to take any action whatsoever on the fact that young people are being criminalised for their political views. I would say that the totality of this letter, once again, is beating children and young people down, because we've seen, haven't we, in elections, the number of young people voting. Now, look, first of all, I believe that you need to participate in democracy. You can't do my job without believing in that. But I have to say to you, I think that commenting on YouTube, I think going out protesting is much more important than a belief that the political system represents you. If you look at a local council election as an example, these children's services directors, you know, all the things that they do are handed down by government or were handed down by the EU in the old days, and they all have their own professional standards body which they adhere to the rules of. The reason I make that point is because when somebody says it's absolutely vital to vote in a local government election, it won't change anything. All that will happen is you will have more people who agree with you in the building attempting to fight against these bureaucrats who are not on our side. I saw a great example, and forget which local authority it's from, where a Reform Council leader said to the council they needed to take down the LGBTQ HBV, whatever it is, flag. And the chief executive of the council simply said no. Now, I think that is a great thing, because what it is it is an example of how the civil service, how the quangocracy, how the police no longer represent ordinary British people. And the fact that we've got Reform councillors in there, or UKIP councillors in there, or indeed independent right-wing councillors, some Conservative councillors as well, making that case and proving what is going on is extremely helpful. But let's talk specifically about Southport. Let's talk specifically about the protests and the prosecutions that took place afterwards. Keir Starmer promised swift justice. Now, I have to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with having criminal prosecutions expedited, and indeed having more serious punishments where something has gone very wrong. So, as an example, more serious punishments and expedited court cases were given in the case of the riots that took place, first of all in Clapham Junction and then right across the country. I don't think it started in Clapham Junction, did it? It started with the shooting of Mark Duggan by the police, and the fact that it was demonstrated that that was a wholly reasonable thing to do. But that's not particularly relevant. But those riots took place, and of course there was extremely swift and extremely severe justice. I went to court to see some people being sentenced. I have to say, young black men were getting 3 years in prison for stealing bottles of Volvic, whilst a guy called Bryn Phillips, who was a lefty Guardian writer, and a white guy, middle class, he had burnt down a corner shop. I met the Asian guy who owned the corner shop, who was devastated. By the way, his community rallied together to buy stock for him back. But that guy dodged a prison sentence because Lord Glassman from the Labour Party had written a letter of support for him. But nonetheless, I don't mind expedited justice, and I don't mind more stiffer sentences strategically to ensure that we protect our public and the criminal justice system as a whole. But what is good for the goose is good for the gander. You can't sit round and do absolutely nothing about the situation with grooming gangs. You can't sit back and do absolutely nothing about Bob Villan and then at the same time expedite cases where it's quote unquote far right protests. But let's talk a little bit more about the protests that the Children's Services directors were so concerned about. It is garbage to say that Andrew Tate and Tommy Robinson were responsible for the riots that took place after Southport. First of all, they were principally peaceful protests. Secondly, I'm not so sure that it is right to say that that all of these people who were prosecuted for incitement were actually inciting people. But thirdly, and most importantly, we all know what went wrong with Southport. Every time there is a terrorist attack, we get a statement from the police saying that this has nothing to do with terrorism and is in fact a mental health problem. So we're all expecting that to come. But also what we expect from the police now are these carefully worded messages which say things like a Surrey teenager, which was a reference, I think in that case, to somebody who was a recent migrant, an asylum seeker who'd come as an asylum seeker when he was 16 from the Islamic world. But because he happened to have his foster home in Surrey, he was described as a Surrey teenager. And then there are all of these things. I forget, I forget all the examples, but let me tell you, when they said of Axel Rudy Cabana, he was an altar boy, that threw petrol all over the whole thing, because it didn't say he is a Christian. It didn't say he is definitely British. Basically, everybody knew that he was a practicing Muslim from a migrant family. Now, the fact that the finer details of that weren't correct, what had happened was entirely the police's fault. Because if each and every person tries to avoid the words Muslim and terrorist, and they write things in a very careful way, but it's a different, a different stylistic writing style every time. In the end, people cotton on to the problem. So I blame entirely the Merseyside police for that. And Axel Rudy Cabana, everybody knows, is practicing Islam in Belmarsh prison, and everybody knows that they moved Tommy Robinson out of Belmarsh in order to avoid him noticing that, because of course people talk to each other. And so what frustrates me is that this was written up as a disinformation campaign by the far right in order to get young people to act in a far right fashion. And in fact, it wasn't. What it was a group of people saying, look, we've had enough of this. We have imported a third world culture. Look, Axel Rudy Cabana is from Rwanda. In Rwanda, there is a machete culture. When you talked about cultural enrichment, you must have realised that we'd enriched British culture with the bad bits of Rwandan culture as well as the good bits. There would not be a machete culture in London if it wasn't for immigration from that part of Africa. The next point, when you look at Lucy Connolly, I have to say, I've stolen this idea from Tom Harris at the Free Speech Union. Well done, Tom. Right, so What Lucy Connolly said roughly was something like, for all I care, you can burn down all of the migrant hotels. And then she took that down. Now, officially, that was incitement. Okay. In the United States of America, in order to incite somebody, what you have to do is you have to literally tell them to do something and then have to either do it or attempt to do it. So instead of saying, oh, for all I care, you can burn down any migrant hotel, you'd have to go, right, I need you to go to a migrant hotel X and do Y. Okay? Because the laws also, even in the UK, on incitement really are intended for somebody with a megaphone in a room. The idea that you would put something out nebulously, if that's a word, and then, maybe somebody might have been incited. In the case of Lucy Connolly, who got 31 months, nobody was incited at all. And it's arguable that she didn't incite anyone. But once again, what's good for goose is the goose is good for the gander. I know not all of you are supporters of Nigel Farage, but can we all agree that the fact that he is now a grade A security risk, that is to say, imminent threat to life, that is to say that the police have identified that almost every jihadi group in the world wants to kill him. The reason for that, and you can ask the police if you ever meet them, it's unlikely you'll meet Nigel Farage's bodyguards, but the reason for that was James O'Brien from LBC Radio said that it was Nigel Farage who started the riots or the protests after Southport. He is the person that has blamed Nigel Farage, falsely it has to be said, for this problem. And of course, the jihadi groups are the people who have now jumped on board with that. If Nigel Farage is killed, it will be because of the way that James O'Brien has lied about him. And yet, we don't care about that. So where are we? Well, once again, I've made videos before about this idea of shooting the messenger or attacking the messenger. And I think that we need to stop doing that. Look, if young people and children are concerned about what is taking place in this country with uncontrolled immigration, who can blame them? I get into trouble sometimes for saying I live in a posh area. Well, okay. What I mean by that is this. The people that are so keen on immigration are not the people who live in the areas that are affected by them. Can you imagine living in central Liverpool, where you are comparatively poor, where a lot of the work from the docks has disappeared, where it is post-industrial, and then the next problem is that 1/3 of the children at your kids' primary school can't speak English when they arrive aged 4.5 or 5 years old. Now, obviously, they learn English fairly quickly, and that is great for them. But of course, what also happens is it holds back the learning of your child, and your child is already significantly disadvantaged. Then you live in a country that has tortured teenagers. Look, the worst punishment that you can think of if you're 13, 14 or 15 is to be grounded for a week. Oh my God, I can't see my friends over the weekend, because aged 13, one weekend seems like, the difference between life and death, which of course it isn't. But that's the way you feel inevitably, right? You want to maximize your life when you're that age. To lock them up for effectively 2 years under COVID was simply cruelty. And to watch the directors of children's services take no interest in that subject and instead be far more concerned about what is going on with Tommy Robinson is unacceptable. And I just want to say a final thing here about Tommy Robinson. Every time I say this, I have to say, because there'll be comments in the description, I always say that I'm not a supporter of Tommy Robinson. The reason I say that is because I don't want people to watch these videos and think I'm just some acolyte who's defending the man. I'm happy to say good points about him, I'm happy to say bad points about him. But more importantly, what I want to say is, look, he's adding to the debate, and it's important to listen to everybody. And it doesn't matter what their background is, it matters whether what they're saying is sensible or not. And I worry very gravely, without talking specifically about a live ongoing case, this whole issue of harassment. And let me give you an example for me personally. When I was in the Conservative Party, I was asked to run for Sunningdale in Berkshire, and I was deselected. Right, and what deselected means is when you are a candidate, but now they've decided that you're not good enough to be a candidate, you have to remove you. And the deselection proceedings were started by a guy called Alan Mabbott, real scumbag, in Conservative campaign headquarters. And my local association, both in Sunningdale and in Windsor, backed me time and time again. And in the end, the only way that I was removed as a candidate was when Alan Mabbott threatened to abolish the Windsor Conservative Party completely. And had he done that, he'd have been able to select our new Member of Parliament, and that would have been extremely dangerous. Now, Mr. Mabbott, phoned people up in the constituency to say that I had undertaken a piece of bad behaviour. Unbelievably, he was literally describing what he'd done in the case of Elliot Johnson, and instead saying that I did it rather than him. So he said that I'd paid compensation to a family. I hadn't. I was subject to a non-disclosure agreement, which I wasn't, and various other bits of bad behaviour. He basically smeared me over an incident that had taken place, a very unfortunate incident that had taken place in 2015. But he continued to smear me. He was the person legally in charge of the Conservative campaign in 2024. After the election, I offered him £5,000 to appear on my radio show to discuss why he had been such a catastrophic failure as the Conservative Party, as a legal head of the Conservative Party campaign. He complained to the company about harassment. And basically what he said because his wife was ill with cancer, which I'm very dubious about that claim, by the way, but because his wife was ill with cancer, to even contact him and offer him an interview was an act of harassment. And of course, when he threatened me, obviously I had to back off because I don't want to end up in court. But my point is this. This is a man legally responsible for the Conservative election campaign. He was in power at the time. He was drawing a salary. He was head of legal for the Conservative Party. It was wholly legitimate to ask him questions. It was wholly legitimate to invite him to an interview. And it would have been wholly legitimate to doorstep him. I warn you that these harassment rules are being used to cover up wrongdoing. This man needed to be called to account for what he had done to a once great political party by pushing the genuine Conservatives out, by running a smear campaign, the Dirty Tricks campaign, against genuine Conservative leaders, for fighting a 20-year war to stop Conservatives becoming Conservative members of Parliament. What he did to me was comparatively minor, but he needed to be called to account for all of those things. But we couldn't call him to account because immediately he started accusing people of harassment. I have to say, if you smear somebody in the media, I think it's wholly legitimate for a journalist to turn up at your door and stick a microphone in your face. I think it's perfectly fine to do that. It's been going on, the doorstep has been going on for hundreds of years in journalism. And I don't want to talk too much about the Tommy Robinson case, simply because it is a live, ongoing criminal investigation, and it's just unhelpful for anybody if you comment. But we need to keep an eye on that. We need to keep an eye on what is called lawfare, and that brings me to the end of this video. Children and young people are being bullied against openly speaking about their political views and their concerns about uncontrolled immigration. Part of it is being expelled from school, but more importantly, it's not just the expulsion, it's the threat. Because the reason they locked up Lucy Connolly for 31 months had nothing to do with Lucy Connolly. It's because they want to threaten people more generally to ensure that they won't speak out about what's happening in their community and what's happening to their family. That is the danger that we hold, and we take this together. The expulsion of children from school, the prosecution of people for incitement when they haven't incited at all, the two-tier element where they will prosecute one person for incitement who hasn't done it, and yet a second person who's entirely guilty of incitement will be completely let off scot-free. And thirdly, this idea of harassment. The minute you call a public official to account, they are the faceless bureaucrats who have bullied our people for decades, and when you attempt to call them to account, when you attempt to doorstep them and put the pressure on them, they immediately shout the word harassment, even though they're public officials. I will tell you of Alan Mabbott, if you are in a position like that, then you have a duty to answer questions from a journalist. Of course, he's never going to do that. And that is something that I think is immensely, immensely dangerous. But more importantly of all, of course, is the way, once again, this example from the Local Government Chronicle, from the Association of Directors of Children's Services, does not address the fundamental issues that young people are concerned about, and instead asks how we can stop them telling the truth, how we can stop them joining protest, how we can stop them being concerned about their community. And that is something that I'm extremely worried about. By the way, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Patriot Fund. The Patriot Fund is supporting various causes, including the Women's Safety Campaign, including getting legal advice for things like this. We've also started doing, tentatively, a little bit of casework when people write to me and they have problems. We are helping them out, and we're still trying to get on with that job of getting cameras out to people who are attempting to fight for justice. If you know any young people who are being expelled from school because of their support for patriotism or because of any free speech issue, please do get in touch. We've got a great relationship with the Free Speech Union. I was over there on Friday helping train up their people to go out and advocate for you. The Patriot Fund backs up all of that work. You can donate in the link below. Until next time, goodbye. The association